Hello and welcome to Eastern Roman History. Today I am joined by Dr. Byron Waldron of Sydney University, and today we'll be continuing our rankings of the 3rd century emperors and the Tetrarchy. And today we'll be covering the first Tetrarchy, Diocletian, Maximian, Constantius I, and Galerius. Hello, Dr. Byron.
Hi, thanks for having me again.
Right, so Diocletian is an epoch changer in many ways.
Literally so. The epoch of the Age of the Martyrs, a dating scheme begins with Diocletian.
One of the reasons why we have the Anno Domini system today is because the man that came up with it wanted something to replace the Diocletianic dating system which Diocletian came up with. So I believe he started dating years from the beginning of his reign when he was proclaimed emperor.
It's the Christians under him. They were doing it because they viewed his reign as such a sort of the beginning of a new age of martyrdom and the Christendom that arose out of those ashes.
Hmm,
It seems to have become unpopular, perhaps because of the importance it laid at Diocletian's feet.
right. In many ways, Diocletian is not only things change more generally for the Roman Empire in pretty much every aspect of life, it's the beginning of the end of the Principate and the beginning of the Dominate, which had been in a process of changing throughout the 3rd century, and we've seen that with people like Aurelian, Probus, and Gallienus making changes to the character of the empire beyond just enacting reforms. But it's really Diocletian that takes those initiatives and turns them into what's called the Dominate, which is derived from how he styled himself as Lord and Master rather than just Imperator and the
Yes,
Princeps.
Dominus.
Republican tradition of the Roman Empire goes out the window under his reign, and it, he he pulls back the curtain and reveals the Roman monarchy for what it is, and elevates it to something that the Romans hadn't really seen for some time. You get emperors that try and become very monarchical, like Domitian, but it's really Diocletian who manages to do that and also get away with it as well. He's not murdered.
Yeah, Domitian is an early example of that taking away the all these republican trappings and like the building program of Domitian, this huge palace with very imposing halls, and he would sit away from all the people at the banquet and kind of watch them as
Mm.
kind of a separate and quasi divine entity. And Diocletian is doing the same thing, but with more success now, I guess, partly because time has changed things.
Yeah.
It's just on that the term dominus, for example. Dominus had been used as an informal term to refer to emperors in, for example, literature of the 1st century AD. So it had been around a while, but it first started appearing on inscriptions referring to the emperors in the 2nd century. And then with Aurelian, it started appearing on coins produced by the imperial mints. So
Mm.
we're seeing this progression. Eventually, when Diocletian abdicates, he these we see a lot of coins with Dominus being used to refer to him.
Mm. I do also wonder if the acceptable appeal of monarchy for the Romans had something to do with the fact that lots of emperors were being proclaimed in the provinces and also never showing up in Rome, like Maximinus,
Mm,
in that you could have someone from Thrace become emperor and never go to Rome, so he doesn't have to worry about pleasing the Senate or following Roman traditions and like jump through the hoops that Augustus had to. In that he is a monarch, but he also has to make sure he doesn't act like one.
Yeah, sure. The Senate is increasingly irrelevant power broker. Yeah.
So I think Diocletian goes right at the top. I think he's an exceptional emperor. Not just in the fact that he was able to change lots of things, but his achievement as well. As much as Aurelian was responsible for reuniting the Roman Empire and restoring the world, it's Diocletian who really brings the 3rd century crisis to a final end. Not only brings it to an end permanently, which in many respects Aurelian failed to do, but he also sets up how the empire operates for the next 400 or so years. I mean, it does get adjusted by emperors such as Constantine and Justinian, who changed lots of things, but they're still working within Diocletian's framework. And you see all of these reforms not just like in the economy or the army, but it's the whole shop of things that you could reform. He reforms religion. He reforms or has policies related to religion. He reforms administration, the army, the whole political makeup of how the Roman Empire operates. So you have the Tetrarchy. He continues to revive the economy, and also introduces a imperial budget and reforms the annonum militaris, so that rather than a ad hoc emergency levy, it becomes a proper institution to fund the army without necessarily having to rely on the worthless currency he was having to deal with. So if his soldiers needed spears and provisions, he could tax that directly from his people and make sure his army continued to operate without having to set up dozens of mints to mint out worthless coins to pay his troops to buy those things. So that he managed to solve long term a lot of the problems that 3rd century emperors had struggled to contend with. I mean, his reign isn't perfect, and some of his reforms, in retrospect, can be criticized for future difficulties. So, like, the administration it does become prone to corrupt practices. So, I mean, one of the most famous examples is the corrupt governor of Africa during the reign of Valentinian, a guy called Romanus, who manages to get away with nicking everything from Tripolitantia and
Tripolitania,
and Lepsus Magna. He requisitions all of their supplies, then moves away and lets the Moors sack their surroundings, and then succeeds in quashing their attempts to rectify the situation. It could be quite difficult for people to get a direct line of contact with the emperor. But at the same time, the situation that had been the case before when Diocletian took power was that no one was really getting to emperor because a lot of the administration had started to break down, and administering the empire had crumbled quite a bit. There's a rescript from the reign of Philip the Arab, where it's begging the emperor to do something and try and solve the situation. I think it's from Gaul, and the way it's framed, it sounds like that was never really addressed by anything.
It was often quite difficult to get to the ears of the emperor, regardless of whether it was the pre-Diocletianic or post-Diocletianic period. I think in the case, certainly a large bureaucracy does make that difficult as well. I suppose also one of the issues with the Valentinian period is
the empire is in crisis again by that point. I mean, Diocletian certainly had wars to fight, but Valentinian is constantly having to be on campaign, plus send out generals to fight various wars, like in the Great Conspiracy in Britain and the usurpation of
Mm.
Firmus.
And also Valentinian and Valens both had the the issue of because they were outsiders, they were sort of they were these quite a lot like the third century emperors. They were Balkan generals from the Balkans, and they seem to have viewed themselves as outsiders in relation to the aristocracy, and so they relied. Prosopographical studies by David Potter, for example, have shown this, that they appear to have relied quite heavily on a very select circle of aristocrats whom they trusted. And the problem with that's a reliable network to rely upon, but it also does mean that if one of the people within this inner circle, for example, Remigius, who I think was the brother of Romanus, if they're being corrupt, they're more likely to get away with it.
Yeah.
And so I think that's also something to keep in mind about the Valentinian example. But certainly, I think establishing that bureaucracy, while it's a solution, it also, of course, brings different problems with it.
There are also some examples from Diocletian's own reign where the administration was starting to already show signs of some of its later detractions, like the proliferation of officials, so just bureaucrats inventing new offices for their friends to fill.
Right.
There's a letter from one of the governors of Egypt addressed to the Tetrarch saying that, can you send me a governor, and when you do so, you will need 5 or so officials for this, and that's all you need. The rest of that lot can be sacked, basically.
Right.
And there is a kind of an idea that bureaucrats are making jobs for their friends and just bloating out the imperial system. But at the same time, I think a good case can be made for a lot of cases where not corruption, or even in cases where you do have corrupt things going on, but they're still doing their jobs. You have the empire, you have the restoration of justice throughout the provinces, and a lot of the provinces, because they have been made smaller and 2 extra layers of administration have been placed on top, the organization of the empire to deal with military crises and at the same time civil problems is much improved. You don't really have the same breakdown of the administration that you do in, say, the 5th century, where you have the surprising case of the administration outlasts the Roman Empire itself in some places.
Right.
It's like
yes.
In Gaul and Britain, where things keep operating despite lacking an imperial direction.
Yeah, I mean that is quite telling that this post-Diocletianic administration is seemingly hardier than imperial authority itself.
And I get that kind of need to make Rome's institutions tough from the Tetrarchy. So we were saying before about how Valerian's system was a very good idea, but it kind of broke down before it could really get going. And Diocletian, right at the beginning of his reign, he appoints a soldier, Maximian, to look after the Western Empire, first as Caesar and then as Augustus. And you could also proxy Carausius in Britain as kind of like a third potential emperor. I mean,
sure.
The Tetrarch's relationship with him is hostile.
Yes.
But they do come to a agreement at some point. But you have, for most of Diocletian's reign, you have at least 2 or more emperors in charge of something. And in the 293, 292, he adds 2 more emperors, Constantius and Galerius, as Caesars, so that no matter what happens, even, say, Diocletian is killed or Maximian falls ill or something, there's someone to replace them. If one of them does die, you still have 3 of them around the empire. And by having 4 emperors, the actual territories they have to look after are a lot smaller. So they don't really have the case of what Probus and Aurelian had to do, was basically try and be in all parts of the empire at the same time.
Be
Where
constantly on the move.
So you have great feats of logistics to your name, but at the same time you've got usurpers popping up everywhere, and you constantly have to go from frontier to fight back attacks from barbarians. Whereas the Tetrarchs, although they are being attacked from external enemies, like Constantius gets attacked by the Franks, he beats them off. You don't have that same need for the emperors to go around and constantly have to try and fend off the empire.
Sure, because there's literally one on every major frontier.
And also, they almost double up as well, because they have a Praetorian prefect each, who this is still the period when they had military obligations as well as civil ones. So reconquest of Britain after Carausius is murdered by the usurper Electus. It's Aureolus. No, not Aureolus.
Asclepiodotus.
Asclepiodotus, thank you, who leads the conquest of Britain with Constantius I.
Yeah, and Asclepiodotus seems to be the one who actually wins the major battle, because it was a two-pronged surprise offensive where it seems that Asclepiodotus landed on the southern coast of England and started moving east, and so Electus left London to meet him in battle and got defeated. Meanwhile, Constantius showed up with the other fleet and went straight to London and occupied the city while Electus was absent.
Which is where you get that famous golden medallion of
the Aris medallion. Yeah, you're right. There are 2 Praetorian prefects in addition to the 4 tetrarchs, and they still had military responsibilities. So, yeah, in a way, it's a college of 6.
Yeah, so I think it's these kinds of measures in that they aren't exactly perfect. So, like, the Tetrarchy does break down after Diocletian abdicates, but while he was in charge, you had 20 years of it working, and one could quite rightly argue that it works after Diocletian abdicates, that you didn't manage to have in the rest of the 3rd century crisis. I mean, even before, with people like Septimius Severus, his son murders his brother, Geta, and then he's murdered, and then you have a rival dynasty try and take over with Macrinus, and then you have Elagabalus is placed on the throne, and then he gets murdered because he's a lunatic, and then you have the whole problem with Alexander in that he's fine while there's no crisis going on, but as soon as there is, then the cracks really start to appear, and then you have a civil war after his death.
Yeah, it has to be said, in general, because of Rome's political traditions, which are republican and then become this sort of pseudo-republican principate veneer, this is not a society that's well set up to actually have lasting dynasties, because there are no rules of succession. You're not meant to acknowledge that there's actually a king. It's the Severan dynasty or the Constantinian dynasty or the Second Tetrarchy. They generally don't last. They tend to collapse within a couple of generations. It's an inbuilt problem within Roman dynastic practice, because it's sort of an unspoken rule anyway.
Diocletian's innovation of having these 4 emperors operating, and that you get the first smooth succession since the beginning of the 3rd century, that you're actually able to have Constantius Galerius become senior emperors, and then 2 more emperors take their place, without a revolt happening immediately, or the whole system falling apart. Well, I mean, you could argue about Constantius, but you could make the other argument of, had he lived, then the Tetrarchy could have continued fairly securely for another generation.
Sure.
Diocletian, he's one of those emperors that he really changes things. He really changes the game, so to speak, about the empire of the Principate is long gone. At the beginning of it, it's on the way out anyway, in many respects. And he replaces it with a system which certainly does have flaws and buckles a bit in the 5th century and late 4th century, but at the same time, you could argue it's a far more resilient system than the one that Augustus set up.
Sure. I think I have to, yeah, I have to agree. I think Diocletian is an exceptional emperor. And I think there are many reasons why that is. Well, I mean, for a start, he takes power in 284. And if you put yourself in the shoes of people living at that time, they're going to be assassinated or overthrown in 2 to 5 years, because that's simply the norm at this point in time.
If you're
And
lucky.
that's it. He may have only had a few months. He may have been defeated by Carinus or by Sabinus Julianus, the Praetorian prefect who took power in northern Italy around the same time that Diocletian usurped. And yet this guy lasts for 21 years and then abdicates at the height of his power and then continues to live for 8 years in retirement. Well, I go with 8 years. There's a bit of debate. One of the strangest things about Diocletian is when he actually died.
Yeah.
It's because it's not actually clearly known, but which is very strange. For survival alone, he almost immediately earns exceptional status. The crisis of the 3rd century, you can see how it pretty much, there'll be more crises to come after Diocletian abdicates, so to speak. There'll be political crises, albeit of a different nature. It's more of a crisis within the college, this sort of dynastic rival co-emperors crisis. But within his reign, we have sort of the last of these pseudo-separatist usurpations happening. Like we had the Gallic Empire in the 260s and 270s, and we had Palmyra as well around that time. We have the last of them with Britain and Northern Gaul under Carausius and his successor / killer Electus from 286 to either 295 or 296. It's a matter of debate depending on various sources. But we have the last of those. That regime is defeated. We have a final large usurpation in Egypt under Domitianus and Achilles that is defeated by Diocletian himself. He personally besieges Alexandria for 8 months, I think, and eventually forces his way into the city. There's a whole story about how he said that he would not cease the bloodshed until the gore had reached the knees of his horse, and then fortunately his horse slipped on the blood and got the blood on its knees, and so Diocletian called a stop to it. He and his co-emperors put down major usurpations, which were very typical of the 3rd century crisis, but they're sort of the last major usurpations of the period. Meanwhile, I mean, we'll get to it more with Galerius, but Galerius wins arguably the greatest victory over the Persians, to be won until perhaps the 7th century with Heraclius.
Battle of Santala.
Yeah, I mean, he chastens the Sasanians in a way that hadn't happened to that degree, I guess with the exception of the sack of Ctesiphon. But this was, Nasser was waiting for him. This was a battle that the Persians were prepared for, and they lost in a big way. And that happens in 297 or 298 and is another big kind of, the tides are finally turning sort of moment. So we have all these sort of major military and political achievements, but also Diocletian is the most hands-on emperor, the most interventionist, proactive emperor that the Romans have experienced since Augustus himself. And, he would arguably only be matched by a select few later emperors, such as Constantine and Justinian and Alexius, in terms of the degree to which he is politically proactively engaged with changing and transforming his empire. I mean, the amount of reforms he actually institutes and how innovative they are is quite staggering. You talked about the Tetrarchy itself, this college of four emperors, and unlike previous colleges, they're four active emperors. None of them are sort of nominal child Caesars. They're all active. They all have their own field armies. They can all legislate, although the degree to which any of them can issue edicts, they seemingly can, but the important empire-wide edict seems to be the preserve of Diocletian. And I guess, and I think that's an important aspect of this too. Diocletian hasn't actually divided the empire yet. What he's done is he's basically found three helpers who have important administrative and especially military powers.
He is almost like a first amongst equals in the Imperial College. But I think also he was very clever, just to add on to the Tetrarchy, in that initially he made Maximian Caesar, but then he also, the following year in 286, he makes him Augustus. So not only does he give him more autonomy to act on his own, with deferral to Diocletian, but he also, by making him at the top, he removes him as a political threat, because if he's already at the top of the pyramid, why would he revolt?
Exactly, and you can kind of see that with the Caesars too, because we know that Constantius in the late 280s was a successful general. He fought the Bosporan Sarmatians, perhaps the Roxolani, in the around 285 or 286 under Diocletian, before they're moving west, where he appears to have won within a particular panegyric to Maximian, indicate that Constantius won one of the few victories won over Carausius on mainland Gaul, and that he managed to force Carausius into a defensive posture with the English Channel as his barrier, his protection against.
Yeah, he managed to retake Boulogne. Would I be right in saying the Saxon shore forts are on both sides of the English Channel?
Yes.
Yeah, he manages to retake the Gallic half, which is the first real step to the reconquest of Britain.
And actually, the thing is, he does that that's like his first task as Caesar. But actually, even before that, he does it the first time, because the thing is, Carausius gets chased from Gaul in the late 280s and has to confine himself to Britain. But then Maximian appears either through storms or through military blunder. It's evident that Maximian suffered a disaster attempting to cross into Britain. And then we can see from numismatic evidence that Carausius was able to re-establish his presence in northern Gaul. And so when you consider those things, and you consider the fact that Constantius is the general that we know of who actually had already managed to win a victory over Carausius.
Yeah.
Either Carausius or his Frankish allies. It's not entirely clear from the sources. And we also know that he captured a king in near Guntia. We don't know much more than that, but we know he managed to capture a German king. So you can see why it might be a good idea for Diocletian and Maximian to make Constantius, make him their Maximian's son-in-law, which they do before making him Caesar, and then actually just make him Caesar and adopt him as the son of Maximian. Because the reality is, not only would he be a very useful helper as an emperor, but you probably don't want a general more successful than Maximian not rewarded in a big way and not tied into the imperial family in some way. And so you can kind of like Diocletian's treatment of Maximian, you can kind of see the same treatment happening with Constantius, that it actually makes a lot of sense in terms of preventing usurpations to bring him into the imperial family and ultimately bring him into the imperial college. Probably it's similar with Galerius, but not nearly as crisis-driven, since there was no Carausius in the east who was causing Diocletian serious problems at that time. Yes, I think the whole tetrarchic arrangement is a very clever one, and I think a big part of it is tailored towards preventing rebellions and usurpations.